Joining me right now, David Nir, political director at Daily Kos, publisher of Daily Kos Elections, someone who comes on the program quite a bit and who is following all of these races that we have been talking about and certainly everything coming up. Welcome back to the program, David Nir.
It's a pleasure to be back.
And on another day after a pretty stunning election where we saw results that I think just show much more incredible energy and a great prelude to 2020. Tell me your thoughts.
I strongly agree, and I want to highlight a couple of the most important points from last night. Even though these were local elections, Trump still hovered over these races in a huge and important way, and not in a good way for the GOP. In Virginia, I think there's really no question that Trump cast a toxic shadow over all of these races, which is a big part of the reason why Democrats are able to flip both houses of the legislature there. And in Kentucky, you sort of had the opposite situation. Matt Bevin, deeply unpopular, tried to tie himself to Trump at every possible opportunity, even bringing up impeachment, which has nothing to do with the Kentucky governor's responsibilities, and it didn't save him. And guess what? Trump is going to be on the ballot next year, as we can probably expect. And that's not going to be good for the GOP.
Mm-hmm. And not only did Bevin hug Trump and all he was talking about was impeachment and you have to vote for me to save Trump, but then Trump went there the night before and he actually said, you have to vote for Bevin to save me. So, I mean, and some of those people in that arena said, sorry, no, I'm crossing over, because it's clear that when we look at the other races in Kentucky, people who supported other Republicans just decided they weren't supporting Matt Bevin. Talk a little bit about, because we're seeing the Trump campaign and Trump himself trying to push this idea that, you know, there was this double-digit gap. Bevin was way behind, and Trump almost brought him over the finish line. But in fact, this race was tied from a few weeks ago.
Yeah, this is one of the most absurd pieces of gaslighting that the GOP is trying to pull. And it's not just Trump, it's the entire Republican Party, including RNC chair Ronna Romney McDaniel. These insane claims that Matt Bevin was down 15 points in the polls until Trump showed up and, almost got him over the finish line. And it's really too bad. You don't think Trump could have gone the extra mile to get him 16 points up? But they also made the same claim in Mississippi, which is even more ludicrous. Solidly red state where the Republican won by, not an awesome margin. But again, another race that was always pretty close. There was no it's an absurd notion to think that Republicans in Republican states were down 15 or 20 points right before the election.
Right. And just focusing in on Mississippi for a minute, that race, Jim Hood, the Democrat, against Tate Reeves, a Republican, we shouldn't even be talking about Mississippi. It's not something that should be a problem for a Republican in terms of winning the governorship. The fact that it was close and Donald Trump had to go there, and that even this win is a single-digit win, that tells us something.
I completely agree, Mike. I think that's one of the most important points anyone can make about elections in the Trump era. This was something we started noticing all the way back in 2017, where you had these special elections in really red turf, and Democrats weren't necessarily winning them, but the margins they were putting up were much, much better than they historically ever had. In a lot of these races, Democrats hadn't even contested these elections. And, a lot of sort of traditional media pundits and certainly Republican operatives were dismissing this as, these are moral victories. Well, you know what? They actually were a lot more than that. They were bellwethers. You have to look at the margin. You can't just look at the win-loss record. And you're exactly right to point out Mississippi. Republicans should be crushing there. They shouldn't be winning by just 6-7 points.
Let's focus in on what's going on for a minute in Kentucky. Matt Bevin, in true Trumpian fashion, has refused to concede, even though everyone who has looked at this, who's a political analyst, says there's no way he can make up the votes. They're separated by over 5,000 votes, and all of the precincts are in. And he won't concede. The AP hasn't called the race. And now there have been some Republicans in the legislature, the Senate leader, putting out this idea that they're going to try to actually undo this election or step in and do something that would give Bevin the lead. Talk a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, this is part of the most disturbing anti-democratic trend in Republican politics that has really accelerated in the Trump era. If Democrats win an election, they view it as illegitimate and try to find every way possible to roll that back or undermine the winners of those elections. We saw it after Democrats won the governorships in Michigan and Wisconsin last year, that Republicans passed all these power grabs and lame duck legislatures to try to basically strip these Democrats of powers they were more than happy to have guys like Scott Walker have for years and years. So what's happening in Kentucky is all part of the same story. You're absolutely right. There's no way that Matt Bevin can make up this 5,000 vote deficit. In fact, it was just reported earlier that a recanvass, which is the process of sort of reviewing all the votes, has never wound up changing the results of an election in Kentucky. So Republicans are saying, well, let's throw this one to the legislature and we can change the results because of some provision in the state constitution that hasn't been used since the 1890s. And the other thing that Senate president that you mentioned also said is that, well, the Libertarian got 2% of the vote, so that should basically kind of sort of count for Matt Bevin.
Unreal.
So really, yeah, unreal.
To the point that the other Republicans statewide who were up for election won, that kind of throws cold water on the idea that there was some sort of massive voter problem and fraud or whatever they want to say, because it was his race, was the only statewide race that lost like this, right? So how they try to prove that, I think, is very difficult. This idea of throwing it to the legislature, what's your thought on how realistic it is that will happen? Simply because of the fact that people decided they didn't like Matt Bevin, even if they had previously voted for him or voted for other Republicans, I think they would be really pissed off to see something like that happen.
I think you're absolutely right. But the thing that we have to remember is that these lawmakers are, in so many cases, protected by gerrymanders. And those gerrymanders insulate them from the will of the public. That's all part of the Republican plan. And so they can get away with all kinds of extremely unpopular attacks on democracy and still keep their jobs. So I don't think it's particularly likely, but in this day and age, we can't put anything past the GOP. Everyone needs to be on red alert about this.
Absolutely, and it needs to get a lot of attention. What do you think this means for Mitch McConnell? What is he thinking? It's his state. He is one of the most unpopular, if not the most unpopular senator in his own state, as Matt Bevin was the most unpopular governor in his own state. So they share that in common. Yes, other Republicans statewide who won, and he's pointing to that. But he's got to be a little bit worried and seeing that hugging Donald Trump doesn't do much.
Well, I bet if you asked Mitch McConnell for his thoughts on last night's election, he would say that he hadn't heard about it yet. I mean, you know that he is just going to go into hiding over this one. He, you're right, is in a lot of ways in very similar shape to Matt Bevin. I think that with a federal election, though, it's generally harder to overcome. States' natural lean. Trump did win Kentucky by 30 points in 2016. He'll do the same, if not better, next year. And so McConnell is probably safe for re-election, but this can't make him feel good. And the most important thing is that he's probably going to face Democrat Amy McGrath in the general election. She's raised an extraordinary amount of money, and it's going to keep McConnell pinned down. So he's not going to be able to spend as much time as he'd like raising money for Republicans in Arizona, Georgia, Colorado, Maine, because he's going to have to worry about protecting his own behind.
Right. And really, they're already having to focus on places they shouldn't have to be worried about.
Yep, it's all about expanding the playing field. And I think the playing field is going to favor the Democrats next year. You know, there were a number of other smaller races down the ballot in all kinds of corners of the country where Democrats had really astonishing wins last night. I'll give you just one example. In the sort of suburban Philly region, in several counties that have been Republican strongholds since the Civil War, Democrats swept the local offices last night. And this kind of thing happens under the radar, but I really think that it's a big warning sign.
Yes, and we've seen this on council races, city and county council races around the country as well. And then in Virginia, just a real sea change that happened here. And when you say that Trump was, a shadow over all of it, it couldn't be clearer with some of the people who won because they were people directly affected by his policies. The first Muslim American woman elected in Virginia, literally affected by Trump and the Muslim ban, and went into public service because of that. And there were just numerous situations like that, and the number of women who were running as well.
Yeah, the candidate you're referring to, Ghazala Hashmi, she was an exceptional candidate, and she flipped a critical state Senate seat. And like you say, what we saw in Virginia, both this year and in 2017, mirrored what we saw with the U.S. Congress last year, which is all kinds of folks running who typically had not run for office in great numbers before, particularly women and people of color and LGBTQ people. And this is extremely exciting for so many reasons. But among others, for me, is that, wow, we have an extraordinary group of people who we can recruit from now, who are willing to run for office. A few years ago, if you were a woman or person of color, you might have said, I'm thinking about running for this, but really it's not for me. It's not the right time. Now I think that folks are way more encouraged, and it just means we're going to have way more awesome candidates than the Republicans ever will.
And in Virginia in particular, we're going to see a real transformation in a state where demographics have been changing, where Republicans have often had a lock and prevented the kind of protections and the kind of change that people wanted. We'll see gun reform. We'll see protections for LGBTQ people. And we're going to be speaking at the top of the hour with State Senator Jennifer McClellan, who was reelected last night in Virginia and was out there campaigning for others to make sure that Democrats won the Senate back. And she's been running on passing the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and adding another state to the states backing the ERA. So this is really big what's going to happen as well.
Absolutely. And the other huge area is going to be voting rights. Democrats have to expand and protect voting rights whenever they take power, because we always know Republicans only want to engage in voter suppression. And Virginia Democrats have an extraordinary opportunity now on early voting, voting by mail, all manner of ways to expand the electorate, make voting easier. And this really has to be a top priority to lock that in.
Absolutely. David, always great to have you on the program, particularly when there are big wins the night before, and to get your thoughts. Really appreciate it, and thanks for coming on.
Mike, it's a pleasure. I'm happy to come on after every night when Democrats win.
Absolutely. David Nir, political director of Daily Kos, publisher of Daily Kos Elections. Follow him at David Nir, David Nir, on Twitter. And he is, believe me, the person you want to follow for elections, for political analysis. Send him a note. Tell him you love hearing from him. Tell him you're excited about what's going on, and let him know that you love him coming on the show. We're back in a few minutes.
Michelangelo Signorile on Sirius XM.